Hello everyone and welcome to our event called The Future of Europe, What Lies Ahead for Young People. My name is Maisa Mikkola and I'm a member of the Una Europa Local Student Task Force here at the University of Helsinki. Una Europa is an alliance of 11 European universities, including the University of Helsinki, which aims to create a European inter-university environment, a university of the future. Each Una Europa university has their own local task force, which consists of international and internationally minded voluntary students who are interested in European affairs and want to raise awareness of European cooperation among students. With the European elections fast approaching, we in the local student task force wanted to increase especially young people's and students' awareness of the topical issues Europe has to tackle. Most importantly, we wanted to look at these challenges from the perspective of young people and to bring forward the role of the younger generation in shaping the future of Europe. That's how this event got started. Today, we will hear an intriguing panel discussion which brings together 3 speakers from different fields related to European affairs. We are here to have a critical dialogue about issues related to Europe and young people's representation, participation, and influence, including the role of Europe in the world. We are also keen to hear your input and what's missing in the panel discussion. During the discussion, you will have the opportunity to ask questions using Padlet. Just scan the QR code, which you can see on the screen, and type your question. At the end of the panel discussion, we will have a Q&A session for which we, the organizers, will select the most interesting questions asked on Padlet and bring them to the discussion. After the event, you are welcome to stay for a while and chat with the members of Una Europa Helsinki at that table over there to learn more about Una Europa and how you can get involved. But first, we will hear a keynote speech from Sophie Nyyssönen, who is a student and a former board member of the Student Union of the University of Helsinki. She has recently finished her traineeship as an assistant to MEP Alviina Alametsä. Sophie will also moderate the panel discussion. Welcome, Sophie.
Kiitos. In my application, I had written, quote, "and ready to start with you in Brussels this autumn." Then they called me to say I was chosen, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had no idea about the EU. I invite you today to have a peek at the EU bubble through the lens of a relatively young, absolutely not an EU expert at start, someone who discovered something quite special in the peculiar heart of Europe. It would be an understatement to say that it is complex, but very exciting. From Lisbon to Rovaniemi, from Copenhagen to Athens, the amount of languages that you can hear at the Parliament's elevator is impressive. Every week, there was a remarkable reminder of the soft cultural diversity, afterworks by the Irish for St. Paddy's, German carnival with the funniest costumes, the French farmers keeping up with the topical revolution, and they had €14 macaroni casserole for the Finnish Culture Day at the Parliament's cafeteria. For 7 months, I got to represent at events, got to know the structures and attend meetings, but mainly I was in charge of practically all messages concerning my members' calendar. Meeting and interview requests, committee and political group minutes, lobbyist and citizen feedback, altogether 100 to 200 emails every day. At first, overwhelming perhaps, but with practice you get the hang of it and realize the responsibility and the large quality of topics that are under consideration within those walls. Anything from space security paid internships, rights of autistic people, to the framework of cooperation with India. Why should we care? No need to buy a different charger for every device is quite sweet, but so is freedom to live, study, or work anywhere in EU. And this happens to be our home, our lives, our planet. Microplastics are disgusting and you can't get away from them even if you have a lot of money. So can we just stop using plastics, please? Women have died in Poland because they did not get the medical procedures they needed because abortion is illegal. So yes, there are things that are worth caring about. In addition, our old neighbor, Russia, has made us more aware of the overall security matters. Might be a good idea to take a look at the fact that most of the population might have zero preparedness for any crisis situation overall. We need new solutions, new ideas. We, the people, are able to adapt to changes. Could you switch the dial, please? Or is it from here? There we go. No, not yet. There we go, thank you. I would like to address the concept of trust. It can be defined as a firm belief in the reliability, truth, or ability to someone or something. And trust doesn't just appear from thin air. Trust is something that we build together, whether it's between friends or in the society. And how about our trust in democracy? The fear of false information and corruption plays its part, but I want to advocate for hope and the power of education. Not only through schools and universities and the news, but also by encountering each other. Unlike public conversation online that might be watched by thousands, being with someone face to face inquires to also hear the other. Sharing ideas gives us room for doubt and not being certain, so therefore it gives room for us to learn. I'm not saying that singing Kumbaya together is the answer to everything, but perhaps a healthy amount of compassion into this world would not hurt. Situations are, of course, different, and on a national level, there is no room for being naive. Yet, human problems are made by humans, and they can be solved by humans. We deserve representatives that are worthy of our trust, people that understand us, that will work hard with policies that don't make sense, being pushed unfairly, and do it anyways and again. There will be 720 new elected people representing all of the 740 million of us. So let's make sure that they are the best people possible. But I must add that on top of the trust we build in formal institutions, we do need a little bit of rebels. We can thank them for the weekend, for the women's right to vote, and democracy itself. As a comfort to all those who feel a little unsure of the upcoming election, unsure of the world event, I say, you don't have to be an expert in everything. Absolutely nobody is. No need to fake it either, in my opinion. Those who never ask will never learn. And my suggestion to you is decide what the things are that are most important to you and interest you. For me, it was education at first. Pick your own and start with that as a base to following politics. No need to stress about trading policy or solving the world peace single-handedly. Take a little bit of time to follow the news and the candidates of those themes. I encourage you to have confidence in yourself, but not blindly. Spend time with different people, also with those that you disagree with. It's easy to make someone another and make your own bubble echo with only one point of view. Now a short, funny, inspirational poem inspired by a modern British poet, Harry Baker, of the things I learned while in Brussels. I learned that Europe is modern with cutting-edge technology, except Germany's national railway company that takes reclamations only through paper mail. Pasta carbonara does not have cream in it. Best desserts can be found from the Parliament's canteen. Also, the worst desserts can be found from the Parliament's canteen. You can learn to drink beer for the first time in your life when it tastes like mango, and be able to have a pint bigger than your head the next week in Munich. You can get there and back tickets to Paris for 30 euros, just as long as you're prepared to maybe have a bus back, I don't know. Thinking that you can only try when you are 20 and carefree, to realize you can go when you're 30-something, have no money, no prospect, and you're frightened. If you play Voyage, Voyage at any point from your headphones, you're instantly the main character. Thank you. And remember to vote, vote, vote. Up next, let's move on to the panel of the day. Please welcome on stage our panelist, David Inglis, who is a professor in sociology at University of Helsinki. Thank you. Sanna Salo, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And Samuli Leppämäki, who is a board member of JEF Finland, a national youth organization that is a part of the Europe-wide organization, the Young European Federalists. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
We can start from here. Maybe David, could you first introduce yourself a bit more in depth, who you are and how your work or area of expertise is related to EU?
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone who's here and everyone who's online. I'm David Inglis, and I'm Professor of Sociology here at Helsinki University, and I'm very pleased to be asked to participate today. I must say I was rather surprised to be asked, because the way it was pitched to me was this is an event for young people, about young people, and by young people. And one of my friends said, well, why have they asked you? You're ancient. And I said, oh, they'll be looking for the wisdom. That's what they're looking for. So, here it comes. A good way to stop conversation at parties is that when someone asks you, so what's your job? You say, I'm a sociologist. That stops small talk stone dead. It's really guaranteed. But I am a sociologist, and I'm a particular kind of sociologist because I'm a historical sociologist and a theoretical sociologist, which sounds kind of boring, but it isn't, because it means that what I like to do is think in the really long term. I like to think about how things change or how things stay the same, not over decades, but over hundreds of years, and in some cases thousands of years as well. And that's what gives me an interest in Europe, because, of course, Europe, in one way, has been around for a very long time, and in another way, it hasn't at all. There's always been a landmass called Europe, but a thing that's self-consciously called Europe is really quite a recent phenomenon, and it's interesting and important politically to understand how this thing called Europe came into existence. But the other reason that I'm interested in Europe is that in a more kind of data-gathering way, I'm one of the few sociologists in the whole world that has a specialism in the study of wine. And I study the wine industry in terms of its historical development and how it works today. And people inevitably ask me, does that mean lots of free samples? To which I say, yes, that's why I do it. But the European element is, if you look at the map there, almost all of the countries in the EU and on its borders make wine. And wine is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry that directly employs tens of thousands of people and employs indirectly people working in bars and restaurants in the service sector and so on and so forth. It employs millions of people. And tens of millions of people across Europe drink wine in one way or the other. Although one of the ways in which young people are changing is that in wine-producing countries like France, young people increasingly don't drink wine, they drink beer and branded spirits. And there's a kind of globalization of young people's drinking, including that they drink far less than their parents did in terms of alcohol consumption. But if you want to know why I'm interested in Europe, really, it's for personal reasons. As you can maybe hear about how I enunciate English, I'm Scottish. My name actually means English, but I'm Scottish. So there's a little bit of cosmopolitanism already. And the Brexit vote in 2016 was traumatic for millions of us, including myself. Indeed, one of the reasons that I'm here in Finland is because of Brexit, because I didn't want to live and work in the United Kingdom anymore. And so the EU for me is a matter of some poignancy, because really I think that a lot of people in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and now increasingly England only realized too late what they had. It was something that they took for granted, and then it was gone. And that, for me, is the main reason why I write about the EU explicitly. And when I've written about the EU, when I analyze it in the kind of way that someone like me would, the one thing that I emphasize is this. The EU is a remarkably complex thing, made up of multiple different parts. It is contradictory internally. It has all sorts of complications in it. Which is why, when I hear people in everyday life or people in politics say something along the lines of, the EU does this, the EU is bad because of that, the EU is X or Y or Z, I like to tell them, but like, there's not something that's just the EU. It's all these different bits. It's complicated. It's often internally contradictory. And just to say it's good or just to say it's bad is too simplifying a judgment in many, although perhaps not all instances. So in effect, I am interested in Europe because it's just so damn complicated.
Thank you, David. Then, up next, same questions, I'll repeat it. Who are you? How is the EU related to your work or area of expertise? What does the EU mean for you? Sanna.
Yes, so I'm Sanna Salo. I work at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs as a postdoc, as was mentioned, and I don't study the EU explicitly. I study comparative European politics, one might say. So I'm interested in the differences in the political systems, the similarities between these countries, and I've somehow happened upon my topics of interest have happened to have a lot to do with the most recent crises or challenges that Europe and also the EU, by extension, faces. So my PhD, which I did at the European University Institute in Florence, was on the Eurozone crisis, and now my main topic is the rise of the populist radical right. And I think this is how I've become somehow also somebody who's invited to these panels, because this happens to be one of the key challenges that now manifests itself also in the upcoming EP elections. So this is my kind of expertise perhaps related to these EU elections. I also teach European Union politics at the University of Helsinki at the moment. Do I also say something about what Europe means to me at this point?
If you like.
Or the EU? So I think for my generation, as well as yours, certainly, if you're young, it means some sort of self-evident freedom of movement, of a lot of things that we sort of perhaps take slightly for granted, and that we only maybe realize once we travel or try to do something outside of Europe. I was recently going to do a research exchange in the US, and when I started the administrative process to get there, I couldn't believe how cumbersome and expensive that was. In the end, for several reasons, we couldn't go with my family. We ended up going to Berlin. It was so easy. We didn't have to do anything. No visas, no insurances, all the payments, everything works automatically. The only thing that still is so different in many EU countries are the plugs. How can that be? I don't understand. How hasn't the EU already harmonized those? That's a question that I want to ask some MEP. But in any case, so I think it means freedom, something that I think most of us might take slightly for granted as well. But also security, and I think this is also related, not only security in the common way in which we think about this, but in the same way that you mentioned trust, that you kind of trust that if you travel or work in other European countries, that things are done more or less in a way familiar to you. And security in a sense that, for example, if you get sick, you can be fairly certain that you can get treated with a reasonable price, unlike, again, perhaps in the US, if something happened to you there, you would be afraid of how big the bill was. So I think these two things at the very least.
Yes, thank you. And so, again, Samuli, who are you? How is EU related to your work? And what does the EU mean to you?
Yeah, I am Samuli, and like said before, I'm from the board of JEF Finland, which is the youth advocacy network and organization working both under the European Movement Finland and working under the international umbrella organization Young European Federalists. So we are quite networked in pretty much all the EU-related conversations currently, and right now we are very actively lobbying for the politicians to take our goals regarding the EU elections seriously and organizing these youth elections and doing a lot of work regarding the elections, and our international umbrella organization is doing also. And as a board member, as a federal board member, I'm very involved in all of that. Additionally, I do also happen to work at the European Movement Finland, which is above JEF Finland. So currently, EU means everything to me because it's my job, my studies, and my organizational activities. It's pretty much EU stuff all day, every day.
You're very devoted.
Yeah, and especially now during the election, I think a lot of people who are in that EU bubble are doing all kinds of EU stuff and doing it especially to make young people most aware and to increase the voting size of young people in the EU elections, because last time it was so low. And the place where we most operate in is in the middle of this relationship between the politicians in Brussels who are so far away and the young people in Finland who are so close by. Our membership goes from age 15 to age 28, and we have people from all over that range coming to our activities and trying to make them more educated about our European integration and EU issues and EU career opportunities and academic opportunities. And then additionally to that, we try to make the political decision makers more aware about young people's issues. So it's that relationship that we try to make more closer. We're trying to closer the gap between Brussels and young Finnish people, and it's a challenge of its own, but it's a worthy operation, I think.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a thought, David?
Many.
If you don't mind, let's continue so we get to the actual questions. But as a warm-up question, I'd like to ask you guys, what is your favorite European country if you can't choose your own? And David, you can't choose Finland either.
Oh, that's a shame. Because I was going to say, if there's anyone in Migri listening in, Finland is my favorite EU country. mainly because I used to be an EU citizen and now I'm a third country citizen, and having lost one's EU citizenship is a rather awful thing, actually, not just in terms of being able to get back into Helsinki airport if you leave Schengen, Schengen being one of the major achievements of the European Union. I can tell you what my least favorite European country is. That is the United Kingdom, but that's a trick answer because it's no longer a European country. My favorite is Italy. Yes. I'll tell you why, because although Finnish macaroni laatico and tedas have their charms, even at 14 euros a go in the canteen in Brussels, a proper carbonara served in a proper ristorante in the non-tourist part of Rome is one of the great pleasures in life for me, with a little bit of wine, perhaps, as well.
Thank you. Sanna?
Oh no, my choice is the same for obvious reasons. I did my PhD there and I've missed it ever since. I'm a great fan of Italy and I dislike very much the tone in which it is often debated about in Finland, which is mostly related to its problems in the economy or politics. There's so much more to Italy than that.
Thank you. Samuli?
Yeah, I think my favorite European country, if I can't say Finland, is probably Denmark. I'm boring in that sense that I usually remain within the Nordics, but that's the place where I've spent the most additional time in, and I do really like that wherever you are in Denmark, you are very close to the sea, relatively to other European countries.
Thank you. And I have to say mine has to be France, because I went to the French school, and I mean croissants and all this. All right, we have divided this panel into 3 sections. We have a section about the young people, the challenges that Europe faces, and finally, the future. According to the data provided by the Eurostat, about 1/3 of European population is under the age of 30. That's around 150 million people, or the population of Germany and France combined. We will start our discussion by taking a closer look at these young Europeans, their views and beliefs. I would like to start with Samuli, since you are the representative of the youth in this panel. What does the EU mean to young people today?
Well, that's a very challenging question. We were a part of this citizen consultation starting from last year, which involved numerous membership organizations from all around Europe, and we got like 1.5 million responses from different young people about both what EU means to them and also what kind of issues they are concerned about for the future of Europe. And I think we got so many different kind of answers that it's hard to summarize them. I think EU, for many people, it means opportunities, career opportunities, academic opportunities, and then other people think about it on a more vaster scale. It means like solutions to new emerging complex problems, and for some people it just means these services and like health services and passports and stuff like that is taken as granted as like a part of everyday life. I think for the issues that they were concerned about that had like stuff to do with like climate and security and similar subjects that are anyway being discussed now in the EU elections. So I don't think that young people's views are that different based off of the consultation than maybe the general political discussion is. It's just that maybe the communication between the different sectors, between the different dimensions of decision making and young people maybe isn't working that well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sanna? So what does the EU mean for young people today?
So I feel a bit like it's not my place to say, since I'm not particularly young anymore, so to speak on the young's behalf. But since I'm a political scientist, maybe I can say something about the political attitudes in Finland. I wouldn't know about all of the EU countries, and I think they might also vary a lot. But I think regarding to some data that I've gone through from 2022, Young people in Finland are, like the vast majority is pretty positive towards the EU, so over 80% think it's a good thing for Finland to be part of the EU. Also some 80% feel like they have a lot in common with other young people in different EU countries. So the vast majority of attitudes is positive. So young people feel like this is something that benefits Finland and it benefits themselves. But I think what's worrisome is that there's some polarization in those attitudes according to partisanship, for example. So it's clearly those who sympathize some type of parties, particularly the left or the Greens, who are the most sympathetic. But then those who sympathize the conservative parties or the Finns party, they are the least pro-EU. And another trend that I think is a bit worrying is that it's also divided by gender. So those who are young men are much more conservative, or much more, let's say, they're less pro-Europe than women. And since we know from other discussions as well that this kind of attitude polarization is going on within particularly young people, in other questions as well, I think this is a worrisome trend.
Thank you. David?
Well, my job is basically always to answer a question with another question. And it is, what do you mean by young people? And so it varies very much who you ask. You know, if someone is a young person and they're 16, then it's different from when they're 25. And if you go and ask people's opinions in a small place in the Bulgarian countryside, it's going to be rather different from how people think in Amsterdam. And it's going to vary by class and by gender and by everything. But people do ask young people what they think of the EU in the Eurobarometer surveys that are carried out all the time. And if you look at the most recent one, which was the survey that was carried out in April this year, and the report has just come out, then it's interesting to look at the national profiles of what the young people who were surveyed said. Eurobarometer is supposed to express European public opinion. I think what it actually just tells us is about what people think in different member states. There's not really such a thing as the European public sphere and European public opinion, in my opinion, because it's mostly still all nationally based. And indeed, one of the paradoxes of the EU is that we talk about the EU as something, but most life for most people is organized mostly in national ways, still, even within the EU. And if you look at the report that just came out and you home in on Finland and what Finnish young people think according to the limitations of the survey method, because it's very small numbers and you have to extrapolate, but let's say the survey is roughly accurate. Finnish young people very much are close to the EU average in terms of what they think positively and negatively about the questions that are asked about the EU and about life and so on and so forth. That Finnish young people are not outliers by any manner of means. The outliers are actually the young people who are particularly positive about the EU. And those tend to be in places like Bulgaria and Romania, where EU-led opportunities to go to other countries, to pursue educational opportunities, to be able to work abroad and so on, are particularly highly regarded. Whereas Finnish young people are just near the EU average of they think that kind of stuff is good, but they're not really positive about it in the way that they are in Romania and Bulgaria. But the interesting thing about the current survey results about Finnish young people is where they are higher than the EU average is when it comes to when they are asked what should the EU do for you, and they're higher, markedly higher than the average response rate on the EU should protect us. The EU should protect democratic rights, should provide security and so on, and I'm pretty sure that is a function of having a border with Russia and what's going on in Ukraine at the moment.
Thank you. The next question, let's toss out just a few little ideas of, we discussed how what are the differences kind of inside the different young people within the Europe, and how gender might affect young people's thoughts or so on, but like what would unite young people in Europe? What do you think?
Me first?
Sure.
Well, when thinking about this question, I kind of wanted to repeat the old, slightly boring slogan, united in diversity, because I think it really well describes how while European people, not only young people, but people are now by now united by somehow similar culture, by the institutions certainly, by a lot of things, by geography. The particular thing about Europe is that we are diverse, and I think this is what most Europeans value about Europe. I certainly do. So I think this kind of appreciation for the fact that when you cross borders, you're going to find something qualitatively different, something lovely though. You know, you're going to find those lovely croissants in Paris, you're going to find that pasta in Italy, you're going to find in a positive way cultural differences across the borders, yet you are united by institutions, rules, laws that make it easier to cross those borders. I think this is what unites us.
Mm-hmm. Samuli, uniting factors of young people?
Well, since we are at the panel by Europa, I think it would be a crime not to mention the whole academic system, that we have these opportunities for young people to form their degrees through studying at several different countries, do different parts of their degrees, and involve traveling and meeting different kinds of people and different kinds of ideas as a part of that process, and still have the flexibility of the degrees and the learning experiences to be recognized in all the countries. The system is not as flexible currently as it should be based on how we think, but obviously in a longer term time scale the progress has been positive. So I think one thing definitely uniting is the academic similarity, the similarity of career paths, that young people can have these similar experiences, but also different experiences within the member countries, and mobility and transfer is made easier. On a more negative note...
But let's keep up to the positive. Uniting.
Okay.
Or we might go to the challenges in a moment.
I'll get into that later.
Let's keep this a bit lighter, if it's okay. David, shortly, what unites young people in Europe?
What unites them are they have the same challenges, which we can come back to.
Yes.
And more positively, what unites them is, well, they're all inside the EU, and therefore they're all inside EU territory. And then we can talk about the problems of Fortress Europe, but it's certainly probably better to be inside Fortress Europe than outside it, I would say, and people are desperate to get in it. But to try to be more positive for a second,
for a moment.
Young people in the EU all have EU passports. That's a very high-level form of capital that you can use. They all have certain rights to travel. Schengen is a great achievement. They all have rights to work. They don't have to apply for visas to go to the neighboring country or a country on the other side of Europe. And above all, they have Erasmus that allows them to move about. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in Edinburgh. Edinburgh is one of the universities in the Europa partnership, but the only one that's outside the EU. And in Edinburgh, they are devastated that they no longer can participate in Erasmus. Mm-hmm. And again, it's another one of these things of it was all taken for granted that language students would travel around and visa-free, and they'd be able to go study a language in another country. And now the ones in the UK can't do that. And the UK government system that has replaced Erasmus is a pale shadow of Erasmus, and people there know it. So that's what EU young people have got. They've got stuff that allows them to move around relatively freely. That's how the thing that eventually becomes the EU evolves. It's about movement. It's about mobility. Mm-hmm. But, of course, as we know, for some people and not for others.
And I believe the other night there was, in the news, they were saying that people, overall Finnish people and young Finnish people move less than they used to, go work abroad less and look for traineeships from abroad less. This is what I think it said. So maybe also idea to the universities of giving flexibility, not only information, but like having these opportunities showed differently to young people to take advantage of these possibilities that we have, perhaps. But to the challenges then. As Europe is facing many complicated challenges from the war in Ukraine and the climate crisis and the rise of political polarization, it is said to be at a turning point. In your opinion, what are the main challenges that the EU is facing right now? Who would like to start?
Please.
I've just gone to you.
Okay, well, so I think we can think about it in terms of external challenges and internal challenges. So externally, there's a great sort of functional need for the EU to do stuff, to do more stuff, to provide security for its citizens in both economic and certainly in sort of geopolitical terms. There's this war going on, there are trade wars going on. The EU is somehow in the middle of this and should act in ways that it's not completely comfortable doing. It certainly hasn't, it's not used to wielding sort of geopolitical power, certainly not in terms of like hard power. And it has some trouble getting its act together as a collective actor in these realms. But then it has these internal challenges. Oh, and about the external challenges, I should also mention the fact that so many people want to indeed come to Europe, and that this is something that the EU struggles to cope with. But the internal challenges then make solving these external challenges more difficult, because internally we are facing Euroscepticism to the extent that it might now rise in the EP elections, so that it actually matters within the EU institutions. We've had this debate before other EU elections, certainly the 2019 EP elections, but this time it could be different. So I think these are the main challenges. So and not only politically, or let's say not only party politically, we face Euroscepticism. We also have whole states, namely, for example, Hungary, where we have illiberal leaders who are sort of trying to harm or utilize the European political process from within to their own ends, and who also liaise with some foreign authoritarian regimes. So these are also interconnected, the external and internal challenges, and the internal ones make it difficult to rise up to the external challenge.
Thank you. David?
Well, it's the same answer, but that's not going to stop me from rephrasing it.
Please.
So, of course, I mean, it's obvious what I don't know if these are external challenges. They're just like these massive problems, and like to not reduce the list too much. It's basically climate change, migration, and war, and they all feed into each other as well. The challenge for the EU is being crippled internally such that it can't take positive action on those things. But in everyday talk and in political talk, I think that the thing I said at the start about simplifying what the EU is happens all the time. It's like the EU is doing nothing about climate change, or the EU is doing nothing about that conflict, or the EU is do. But to what extent is the EU's inaction or its ineffective action actually the result of member states not being able to agree, of particular member states being particularly obstructive, and in the European Parliament, which ultimately is an exercise in nations, because it's nations' field representatives, and nations' field representatives of political parties, that if you can't agree something in the European Parliament, it's not the EU, whatever that means, that's stopping stuff. It's representatives from particular parties in particular countries, and it's particular governments not agreeing to do certain things. It's the national governments that are the blockage. And really, I think that the main challenge that the EU would always have is getting everybody to agree. Getting all that lot to agree is a mammoth challenge. And I'm glad that it's not my job to make that happen because it's so difficult. But it's not surprising that at the present time, with the rise of certain political forces, that getting movement on climate change, for example, becomes ever more difficult. But then it's often blamed on the EU as sclerotic. The EU is slow. The EU doesn't do this and do that. But who are the ones slowing it? They are national actors.
Thank you. Samuli, challenges that the EU is facing today?
Yeah, all of the really complex external and internal issues that were mentioned here before, they're going to require motivated politicians, experts, scientists, labor workers to be handling them. The main worry that I have is that none of these global complex issues can be solved by people who are already tired when they turn 30. So the mental health crisis that is being faced across all of Europe, and especially for young people, it is increasing at a hard rate, and it's more and more common for people to be burnt out before they even turn 30. So the question comes, who's going to solve these issues, like climate change, migration, even war, 10 years from now, if our current potential future leaders and experts and scientists are already struggling with mental health and not even maybe perhaps getting the services that they need to handle those.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. According to a barometer recently conducted by the European Commission, an average about 1/5 of young EU citizens don't know if they will vote in the upcoming elections or outright don't plan on voting. Although young people are usually thought as pro-European, this is by no means a universal stance. What are your thoughts on the rise of Euroscepticism, especially among young people, and how could this issue be tackled?
Euroscepticism among young people is the one thing that we at the EU bubble or the European youth bubble don't really encounter as much as we probably should in order to increase our argument skills and to better recognize what the issues seen in EU are that they would want to fix, who consider themselves as Eurosceptics or maybe being against EU. We have identified problems in the EU system that we would like to maybe fix or improve upon, and those are like in our election objectives, like to make the democratic system more transparent and more listening to young people and stuff like that. But we don't know really, or I don't know, if our solutions are that similar or our worries are similar to the ones who consider them Eurosceptics. I would guess that at least some of them are the same.
Mm-hmm. Sanna, David?
Yes. So I guess in some sense this is precisely the problem, that we have a society where people are a bit confined to their bubbles and don't really meet. And I guess the sort of straightforward answer to why Euroscepticism is growing among young people or any people is that there's an increasingly powerful counter-narrative to the kind of narrative that we've had for the past, I don't know how many decades, that has been a sort of EU-positive, integrationist, even federalist-ish, liberal. And now within national political systems, we have increasingly skillful political entrepreneurs who are mobilizing a counter-narrative, apparently successfully. So this is feeding then, it's in a way a self-reinforcing cycle where then it also travels across borders and Eurosceptics or right-wing populists, which are often one and the same thing, are thriving in different contexts with slightly different narratives, but in overarching terms with similar frames. So it's a narrative that is sort of then easy to relate to from wherever you come from. and interestingly, even in countries where you don't, for example, have too much immigration, say in Finland or in Portugal, similar types of parties appeal to citizens, manage to mobilize citizens with a similar narrative. So it's an interesting phenomenon.
David?
Well, if you look at how it works in terms of demographics, Euroscepticism of certain kinds is associated with groups of people who are older, who are less well educated, and who are economically poorer. And so, of course, it's easy for certain political actors to talk to those kind of audiences and make them even more Eurosceptic or beyond skeptic. I mean, skeptic is a polite word, it's just anti-EU. But again, I think what we can do is to look to the dear old United Kingdom as an object lesson in what happened and what could happen somewhere else. Because all the surveys about young people in the UK in the 2000s absolutely kept saying one thing again and again and again, and it was young people of all social classes, but especially young people from lower social classes, either didn't know anything about the EU or were apathetic about it. And then Brexit happens, and especially to middle-class young people who were going on Erasmus and so on, it comes as a huge shock. And so it was about, people took the EU for granted, and then it was taken away. And suddenly people gain a European identity that wasn't there before. And that's really a paradox, that you only start to see yourself as European when you're no longer allowed to be European. How can young people do something about it? Well, I think that young people are often told, well, you know, you're snowflakes and stuff like that. This is not helpful. And I've found people, I mean, the whole term young person can be so patronizing, but let's say people who are in their 20s. I've often spoken to people I have in master's classes and so on, and they beat themselves up. Oh, I live in such a bubble. Oh, you know, I'm just in the bubble and so on and so forth. But to a certain extent, I think seeing the world that way actually helps certain political actors because it makes young people easier to attack politically. And you know, there are certain political actors that just view all young people as latte, quaffing, smashed avocado, guzzling, irresponsible people who won't save up for a mortgage. But if there's no affordable housing and you've got no chance of getting on the property ladder until you're 40, if that's what you want to do, then you're kind of, it's victim blaming. What can young people do about it? They have to talk intergenerationally. If there are people, older people in their family that are saying really anti-EU stuff and the young person is pro-EU, then talk. Do intergenerational talks with friends and family and relatives and try to debate it and try to show, yeah, but look, in your life, if the EU wasn't doing that, if the EU wasn't in place, then your life would be worse. And these everyday conversations, if they happened all across Europe, would help if your aim is to keep the EU going.
Thank you. Up next, the upcoming European elections are expected to become a battleground for a number of polarizing topics, from the green transition to the support for Ukraine. What are your thoughts on rising polarization in today's society, and what do you think are the main causes of polarization?
Would you, David, like to start?
I kind of already answered half of that, but what are the causes of polarization? Well, a lot of analysts argue that it's to do with education. There's an argument that says that the main cleavages and divisions in a lot of societies now are not to do with older class-based relations. It's no longer middle class and working class. It's more to do with, well, people go to university. If they've not come from university-going families, it changes their views and opinions and values and attitudes. And so the main emerging social division is between people who've been to higher education and people who haven't. And that then maps on to different kinds of places in a country, where there are places where people stay behind and don't go to the big city to go to university, and then the districts of big cities where everyone is a graduate. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about that argument if it's pushed really far, but there's something to it. There's something going on about what's happened in terms of more people getting more education. That's happened since the 1980s. And if we admit that that is a function of how society works today, and that the division is being created partly on the basis of do you have a higher degree or do you not, then if people are divided on that basis, then political actors can come along and exploit that by talking to the people that don't have the higher education and telling them certain stories that then create further resentment against the apparent haves who have the university degrees. But then those people are probably working in precariat jobs, and they won't be able to afford decent housing, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, of course, in effect, there's something about the way modern societies are developing and structured that create these divisions that certain political forces can exploit for their own purposes.
This is all so grey, so I'm hoping that we could go to the, okay, what can we do about this? But let's finish the round. So about polarization, what do you think are the causes?
Well, one silver lining from the whole debate about support for Ukraine is that it kind of does make for an easy estimate of where the polarization lies, that the parties in the European Parliament who are the most in each of the edges are the most critical about support for Ukraine, both in the left and in the far right, and that's kind of an easy estimate now given during the elections to identify the groups that might be troublesome to cooperate with. Among young people, polarization, there's definitely a social media debate to be had about that, and disinformation campaigns and all of that. And I have no suitable solutions for any of that.
Not yet, but maybe we'll figure it out together.
Maybe.
Sanna?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to add anything to this. I think David summarized it up as well as anyone could, that there are certain social structural reasons why societies might be polarizing. You know, there are certain dividing lines, cleavages, maybe education is one of them. And then there are these powerful narratives that I already mentioned that are being increasingly skillfully exploited by some political forces, including here in Finland, in all European countries. And I think it's really worrisome, some of the news that I've heard recently, that in many countries, the sort of how much people value higher education is decreasing, and particularly in certain disciplines or areas such as humanities, that these are being downscaled across, I don't know, certainly in Finland, in the United States as well. There was a piece in Helsingin Sanomat on this. So it would require a certain amount of knowledge about your history, about society, beyond any kind of sort of profit-making or applicable, like sciences that can be directly applied to in any businesses or so on. Understanding of your world in order to be sort of pro-integrationist or so on. And if this is being sort of devalued, I think that's very unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Can I pick at the watch? Do you guys have a watch? Oh, there we go. Okay, yeah. Lovely. Let's go to the future now, all together, like in the movies. Now that we have talked of the challenges, let's see. How do you see the role of young people in shaping the future of Europe and overcoming the challenges that we've just talked about? Sanna?
The role of young people in the future. On a positive note, I would see it would improve, that the academic opportunities and the career opportunities will only increase as new jobs are being made and technological advancement is going to go forward. So it would seem that young people, and the amount of them, would increase in decision making. But there's the demographic aspect of many member countries where there's going to be more older people and less younger people. So that's a balancing act.
Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely instrumental, simply for like sort of generational reasons, that young people are the ones who are going to sort of take up the job from my generation or so on, and then so it's absolutely essential. So it couldn't be overestimated. Yeah.
I think that you have to say there's a difference between two things. There's a difference between an age cohort and a generation. People talk about generations in a loose way, in a very journalistic way. An age cohort is everybody born between, let's say, 1995 and 2010, right? And they have nothing in common except their biological age and certain material conditions, like they can't afford decent housing. A generation is something different. A generation is like the 1968 generation, that it's people who see themselves as part of a group, and they self-define as, I'm part of that generation. And a generation can be created for more positive or more negative reasons. So sometimes, you find people saying, well, I'm part of the internet generation or the iPod generation, where it's something to do with the leisure or something like that, and it's like a more positive thing. But there's also a more negative thing, that like people who were 20 in 1939 would definitely call themselves the war generation. So there's enough going on in the world at the moment that's both negative and also positive for perhaps people who are in their 20s now to become a generation, and a generation that might find a voice and might work together to change things for what they see as the better. There's no guarantees, but an age cohort is just a bunch of isolated people who suffer the same problems. A generation is a proactive group that says, no, we're not having it. Mm-hmm. We're not having the climate change. We're not having war. We're not having X, Y, and Z. But other people have to help young people in that direction. And what I think is an obvious way in which the EU could get more interest from young people is, again, at the national level. If political parties were able to recruit people to be younger MEPs that spoke to younger people's concerns, then there would be probably more interest in voting and more commitment to voting in EU elections. Because otherwise, it just seems like Brussels is this faraway thing, and it's just a series of objects that operate according to their own logics, and it's a faraway and mysterious thing. But if some young people in a city like this had young MEPs representing them and making a noise in the EU Parliament and drowning out other noisy voices there that otherwise take over, then there would be more youth interest in politics, I think.
Mm-hmm. And final questions for this future section. It's hard to decide, but I'd say, could you name a reason, a very specific reason why young people should vote in these elections?
So I was really trying to think about this question and come up with something catchy, and I wasn't able to, because I think it just comes down to the same boring-ish truth that it's a democratic duty and a great privilege. So most people in the world live in regimes where they have to be more like rule takers and not rule makers, so in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes. And they would like to change that, but they can't. But we here in Europe, we do have the voice. So it would be unwise and irresponsible not to use it. So I think it's perhaps somehow a much repeated reason, but it remains true.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that we are not separated among Europeans currently. We are very inherently tied to each other. There are economic interdependencies, there are dependencies from outside EU. There are issues that we can't handle alone. And that truth is not going to be any less true 10 years from now or 20 years from now. If we don't use the vote now, it's gone forever. Like you can't you can vote in the same elections and another time. And next time there's the next election, it's a different elections. You're going to lose it for 5 years.
Why vote?
Well, I'm irresistibly reminded of what somebody used to say. I had a relative who, when he was very elderly, just wanted to sit in his seat at home and watch trashy TV. And the physiotherapist would come in and get him to walk. And she would say, use it or lose it. And that's what I would say about voting, use it or lose it. Because what we see around the world is that there are political forces and actors that would be quite happy for people not to have votes. And votes have been hard won. And, you know, it's an achievement that people get to vote. And it cannot be taken for granted. And people who don't have a vote desperately want to have one, but in a contradictory way, people who have a vote often don't use it because they take it for granted. It's so easy to forget that in 1945, when Europe was totally ruined, and they had to build something out of the ashes, that was the root of where the EU comes from. And it was basically a generation, a post-war generation, saying, never again, we can't afford to have this again. We've got to do something about it. And out of that, slowly comes the thing called the European Union, and it's democratic. It has every kind of flaw, it has every kind of problem and mess going on. It needs reformed, it needs fixed, but it will only be reformable and fixable if people vote, especially younger people, because younger people will vote in ways that are more hopeful than older people who probably vote for solutions that are non-solutions.
Thank you. We're going to be having some questions in a moment, but I think we have time for one more silly one, which is, and I want to specify this like very much. What do you think is the next big change or small change that you see in Europe? Very shortly, like for example the chargers that we have in the phones, like this kind of weird little change or big change that we're going to have.
I would imagine that the next small change is going to be some addition to the recently approved AI Act or some addition to Digital Markets Act and Platform Capitalism Regulation, because that's such an ongoing project and project that is moving forward all the time. The next big thing I would very much hope is Britain coming back.
Right.
The next small thing is definitely going to be the plugs. You're not going to have the 3 ones anymore. Or well, it doesn't apply to you guys anymore there in the UK, unfortunately. But that's going to be the small thing. The big thing, I don't dare to think. It's never been so difficult to predict anything than it is currently. So I remain in the small things.
The sky is the limit.
Yes. It could either be a huge blow-up, these things could get really worse before they get better, or it could also be a kind of a boring return to the middle, that people actually get tired of the extremes and want to sort of go back to the middle. I don't know, that could be.
Answer, I have absolutely no idea. Because as a kind of historian, I look back and I don't look forward, but I do know, looking back, that the only predictable thing is unpredictability.
Well, I'm personally hoping that it's going to be better medication for period pains and giving birth and so on. So women's health questions. So we have questions from the audience, and it is all blocked. Thank you, Maisa. Let's see what we have. Are you guys ready for this?
Sure.
There might be anything. How much will the situation in Gaza be emphasized in the upcoming EU elections? And is it going to affect the way people will give their votes? Who would like to address that?
Probably not nearly enough. I'm sensing already kind of a media fatigue over the subject, completely like like it's an important issue, very much, and it should be talked about way more. But I'm just sensing that across European media channels, across many member states, the political discussion is centered around completely different, even foreign policy issues. It's about like China, more likely, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to guess that it's not going to influence the votes of people in numerous member countries. It's probably going to be even a bigger subject in Finland than in most other member countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
My impression is that in national debates it might still be relatively salient because it appears to be a party political issue, also here in Finland. But I think at the EU level, simply because member states have really different views among themselves regarding this issue, it might not be such a big thing. But I wouldn't rule out it having an effect at the national level regarding people's party choices.
Yeah, I can only echo that. It's very nationally variable. And I think we can probably speculate that the two main constituencies that are going to be particularly oriented to voting in a certain way because of Gaza are left-wing voters and Muslim voters. And in fact, I mean, it's already quite apparent, I think, in some countries. But I think in national terms, it depends on what the relationship of the country is to Israel-Palestine. For example, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, has actually a long history of sympathy with the Palestinian cause because Irish nationalism makes parallels with the Irish struggle for independence against the British. And I think that Gaza would probably have a quite galvanizing effect in the Republic of Ireland in a way that it might not in some other countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Up next, theoretically, all degrees should be more or less accepted everywhere in the EU. Some countries continue to discriminate students during hiring process for having completed degrees in other EU countries. Example, studying in Italy, Germany, and returning to Finland to find a job.
I'm not sure I got the question.
So all the degrees, like being able to use your degree in different EU countries, basically? Thoughts on that?
It's a particularly hard problem for the students who come from outside EU and try to get their degrees recognized. It's an issue in Finland and in many other member countries and universities, and I think Europa is one of the projects that's maybe trying to improve that and to make the degrees more flexible, because there's no sense in the fact that someone who has almost graduated to a doctor in another country is picking berries at another country because that country can't offer them the 5 study credits, the term that they would need to get the full acceptance.
Yeah, I think we should do much more about that. I think regarding people sort of settling, let's say here in Finland, for example, in terms of, for example, having their degrees acknowledged, we haven't even started to do what we should be doing. I remember when I was living in Sweden during the refugee crisis of 2015 to 2016, or in its aftermath, let's say, they had these whole programs at the Karolinska hospital, for example, where they were retraining Syrian doctors to become doctors in Sweden, and just by going to I don't know, have a doctor's appointment in Sweden, you could see that there were really a lot of doctors with non-Swedish ethnic background there. In Finland, I don't think we're doing nearly enough. I think we should definitely do more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that Finland is quite well known for these kind of things. The not taking seriously foreign students' qualifications, of course you get that in every country to some extent, but I think like Finland is probably one of the bigger cases in that regard. But also I think the distinctiveness of Finland, when I talk to so-called expats, Finnish expats, they're Finnish migrants really, is that they say, well, I've got a degree from abroad and I tried to get a job in Finland and couldn't. Or my work experience is abroad and now I can't move back to Finland. And during the recent elections here, I was actually sitting in a cafe outside near the Finnish embassy in Rome, and there's all these Finns in there who'd just been to vote, and that was what they were all talking about, of how, yeah, we like Italy, but some of us have tried to move back to Finland with our foreign qualifications and foreign work experience, and we can't break back into the labour market again. So it's very much a thing that Finnish people talk about, and it must be really quite a problem.
Yeah, it seems to be quite ridiculous that you actually go to the world and like learn something brand new, something that could change the way that we think about something or otherwise new ideas. You're about to come and bring all this knowledge back, and then you don't get a job because it's somehow unknown, like what is this university, even though if it would come from a capital city university like this degree.
Well, one person that I was speaking to in this cafe said, I think, she said, that they think I'm some kind of traitor because I left.
That's very, very sad, truly. So let's do better, Finland. Next up, looking at the upcoming EU elections, how will the potential outcomes impact young people specifically? How can young people vote wisely?
The outcomes?
Let's go with how can young people vote wisely?
Well, the election machines, what's the English translation?
Voting advice applications.
Yeah, those applications and different kind of services are constantly being improved upon. I'm fairly proud of my job being a part of the EU and I voting application that kind of involves all of the European Parliament groups, and you can put different emphases to different questions. Those are constantly improving so that they give less fragmented results. So that's one tool that can be used, and if young people are more motivated, they can come participate in organizations like JEF or European Youth Parliament or UN or all of these youth organizations that educate, that do democracy education for young people. So that's, if you're more involved in that, you're more likely kind of be making wise
So is your
voting
tip
decisions.
for young people to follow youth organizations that are related to EU to get ideas about how to vote?
Or international activities or
Yes.
international politics in general. It doesn't need to be EU. I think organization activity definitely results in better and more awareness about it.
Awareness, giving like inspiration or thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, I think awareness and knowledge are very important, so to make informed choices. But for me personally, these voting advice applications, they don't seem to work very well. I always get completely weird results, which are extremely fragmented. So let's say from the left alliance to the conservatives and everything in between. And they give very polarized choices often. So I think I, again, have a very boring answer. So I think it's extremely useful to read the election manifestos. You get a pretty good idea of what the party stands for, and they really vary amongst each other as well. I think that's a quite simple way, although some of them are extremely long. But if you even browse, that already gives you a certain kind of tone. You get an understanding of what the party stands for. So I think the most important thing is to be somehow informed, somehow follow the political debate before the elections.
So reading a little bit, not like every day 50 pages minimum or something to be able to have the strength and confidence to vote, but like reading a little bit.
Yeah.
Young people are especially resilient and at the same time especially vulnerable. I think that's the paradox of youth. Young people have biological age on their side. You know, that relatively most people will be relatively healthy. Unlike once you hit 50, you know, you can feel the body changing and you just don't feel so resilient anymore. So youth has youth on its side, biologically speaking. But young people are uniquely vulnerable as well, because when bad stuff happens in the world, it tends to disproportionately affect them negatively. So when the financial crisis hit in 2007-8, it particularly hit young people across Europe and the world badly because it very negatively affected job opportunities and it affected housing. And that was much more than middle-aged people were hit by the financial crisis because middle-aged people had more resources. They already owned houses and so on and so forth. They already were in employment. They already had the skills and qualifications and so on, whereas the age cohort that were hit by the financial crisis, the people in their 20s, were really hit by it. And likewise, COVID. What did COVID do? COVID killed elderly people and totally messed up young people in terms of mental health patterns and educational opportunities.
Absolutely.
So therefore, extrapolate from that, parties that are oriented towards policies that are trying to create regimes of security in terms of what happened during the financial crisis and what happened during COVID would be the ones that would be sensible to vote for because they're trying to create more secure overall conditions for overall populations, but with a special focus on young people's vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
One tip.
Would somebody want to?
That's similar to a question that we had before.
Yeah, but definitely.
Where do you think the students from Gaza study now? Where do you think they study that their 12 universities have been bombarded? Why aren't we talking about that?
Oh my God. So I believe that we could maybe discuss the future of students specifically in Palestine, if you'd like.
Well, I don't know. It's a very challenging situation. I would hope that like putting more funds into the Students at Risk initiative could be one solution for students who have maybe left there, for the future at least. But it's a very unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm really not an expert, but I think Finnish universities did quite a few things for the at least researchers. I also think maybe also for students from Ukraine, taking them on with like less procedure than would otherwise be required. So maybe some schemes like that, maybe some sort of best practices from how people from the Ukraine were helped could also be applied.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know the answer, I know the answer, and we all know the answer. The students are not studying because the universities have been destroyed, and many students are dead and maimed and injured, and it is a horrific situation. Now, you're probably right insofar as maybe we should have raised it already, but our remit was to talk about within the EU. So I agree with you that it's somewhat absurd to have any meeting at this moment in time and not talk about it. So thank you for raising it. But please also understand that we were given a remit to talk about within the EU.
I have a question concerning EU. So, I'm a student in the University of Helsinki, and we call the University of Helsinki to follow its own ethical guidelines and in line with its commitment to promote universal human rights and defend academic freedom, join the academic boycott of Israeli universities called by Palestinian civil society. So the university has agreed to revoke its or freeze its exchange agreements, but now we want it to stop collaborating with Israeli universities and state institutions in research projects. And these include centrally the research projects funded by the EU. And plus, even though this inclusive, also to provide full disclosure of the university's financial investments in companies that profit from Israel's apartheid regime and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So I want to know, do you support students and all the people who are fighting for the academic boycott?
So a question about thoughts on the academic boycott suggestions or what would that be? measures towards the University of Helsinki specifically?
Personally, I do support and I did sign the petition. I can't say for sure for my organization, JEF. Our international umbrella organization did do a federal statement that asked for the genocide to be stopped and had a lot of demands. It's a very long document and you can find it online, and I was somewhat a part of doing it. But I don't remember if the academic boycott was in it. Unfortunately, it definitely should be. Yeah.
Right. We have just 1 minute for last comments. If you want to address towards the questions for the University of Helsinki specifically.
Well, I mean, I think that we, on the stage, who are we speaking as? I am not going to respond in a personal capacity because my personal politics are not relevant to me being a panelist. But as a professor at the university, it is my duty to engage with what you are saying and give it the most serious consideration. And I promise you I will read your material and seriously think about it and think about what I should be saying to the university authorities and to my colleagues.
Thank you. All right. Up next, I believe it's time to say a great thank you to all of our panelists for coming today. And thank you for our audience. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you to all the speakers for such a thought-provoking discussion, and thank you to the audience for your great questions. Our event has now come to an end, but remember that you are most welcome to stay and chat with the members of Europa Helsinki at that table over there. Last, but definitely not least, remember to use your vote in the European elections on the 9th of June or in advance between the 29th of May and the 4th of June. I hope you have enjoyed this event, and I also hope to see you at our future events. Thank you and have a nice weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.